Good afternoon. My name is Peter Kappers, and along with my colleague and co-author Anna Spurlock, we want to thank you for attending today's webinar on LBL's recently released report titled A Handbook for Designing, Implementing, and Evaluating Successful Electric Utility Pilots. Although the title suggests the content pertains specifically to electric utilities, many of the concepts and process proposals are really germane to any regulated utility and certainly have applications to other industries and organizations. Over the next 40 minutes or so, we hope to summarize the contents of the report, leaving about 15 to 20 minutes for questions at the end. Now, since you're all on mute, please use the Q&A function to submit your questions as they come to you during the presentation. Anna's going to collect those and will facilitate the Q&A session once the formal presentation is complete. So with that out of the way, let's get started. So the first thing we should get out of the way is what we mean by the word pilot. Like so many things, it means different things to different people. And so to make sure we're all on the same page, we have chosen two different definitions of the word that seem to be the most common in the electric utility industry today. First, it refers to an activity undertaken as an experiment to determine if something should be pursued more broadly at some future point in time. Now, as an example, a utility identifies a small portion of its residential customer population in order to learn more about customer response to a particular type of time-based rate. The utility's goal is to use the outcome of the pilot to determine if that rate should be rolled out more broadly to the entire customer population. Alternatively, the word pilot can refer to an activity undertaken as a test to ensure success of something that has already been decided will be undertaken more broadly. Now, an example of the second meaning would be a pilot that defaults a larger number of residential customers onto a time-based rate to ensure that all the utilities' back office systems can handle a planned and agreed upon future full deployment of all residential customers onto that rate. Now, for the purposes of our presentation and the report that serves as its basis, we will focus on the first definition, although many of the components of the process discussed certainly do apply to the second. Before we turn to the step-by-step process that regulators, policymakers, and utilities can follow to help ensure a pilot is successful, there are a few other things to mention. First, throughout the presentation, we'll be largely using pricing pilots to illustrate the points made. Now, this is in large part because Anna and my experiences have centered predominantly around these types of pilots. However, the process we discuss certainly does relate to pilots that have nothing to do with retail rates. It can apply to pilots that are experimenting with regulatory revenue or business model alterations, technology demonstrations, or really anything that's being pursued on a small scale to inform the willingness for doing it at a much larger scale at some point in the future. Now, admittedly, some of the steps may be more critical and applicable than others, depending on the exact nature of the pilot under consideration. We'll try to point those out as we move along. Second, we also want to be clear on what we mean by success. A successful pilot need not produce the expected results. So long as the pilot is implemented as designed and the outcome is determined to meet the necessary levels of rigor, accuracy, and precision that subsequent decision-making requires, an outcome counter to initial expectation should be viewed as a learning experience and not at all as a failure. It's only when the pilot produces unexpected results because of weak design, poor implementation, or faulty evaluation should the outcome be considered unsuccessful. It's best to know that something doesn't comport with one's a priori expectations when implemented on a small scale, rather than implementing something on a much larger scale where the stakes are considerably higher and only then finding out that expectations are not met. So, with all of that out of the way, let's get to why you're here. Now, in my mind, the basis for what you need to know about running a successful pilot is really grounded in something you learned back in 7th grade science class. The scientific method. All of the different steps in the process that we lay out really have their roots in this simple yet powerful concept. So we're going to use it as an organizing framework in today's webinar to more clearly show the connections between the steps in our process and just basic elements of good science. So let's start with the first step, defining the purpose of the pilot. You And your organization should begin this entire endeavor with one simple question. What do you want to learn about? There are lots of things you could seek to better understand within the confines of a pilot. Suppose there's interest in moving towards broader adoption of time-based retail rates for a residential customer class. A pricing pilot could help all affected parties better understand the issues related to customer acceptance and retention. A pilot could derive electricity consumption impacts and bill impacts associated with a transition to a particular time-based rate design. It could focus on determining these impacts for the entire customer population, or maybe for particular subpopulations of interest, like low to moderate income customers, elderly customers, or those with particular medical needs. In addition, the pilot could seek to differentiate these effects based on whether customers are able to voluntarily enroll or are defaulted onto the pilot. Next, you should make a determination about how the learnings associated with each of these issues will be subsequently applied for future decision-making. There really needs to be a clear linkage between the issue that the pilot seeks to learn more about and how those learnings will better inform decisions down the road. Absent such a strong connection, the value of designing the pilot around this set of issues is going to be greatly reduced. So now that you understand the purpose of the pilot you're thinking about, you would be wise to really learn a little bit more about those issues. In particular, you should seek to better understand what others may have learned about the same set of issues. A literature review will really help reveal where there have been consistent findings on your issues of interest. It'll also allow you to identify situations where outcomes have been more varied or even inconclusive. The goal of this review is to ultimately determine if the learnings from these other pilots are sufficiently transferable to your situation. If they are, well, then a savvy and cost-conscious utility or regulator could determine that a pilot really isn't necessary. The pilot can simply be skipped, and the results of the lit review can be used in lieu of a pilot for decision-making purposes. Now, more often than not, however, these other pilots differ too much from, let's say, your retail electricity environment, your location, or your customer base to make their results sufficiently applicable. The end result is your pursuit of a unique pilot. Now that you better understand what others have found on this set of issues and determine that you need to move forward with your own pilot, you'll want to develop a better sense of what you expect may happen if you were to test these issues that you want to learn more about. And to do this, the list of previously developed issues needed for subsequent decision-making should be converted into research questions. The more specific these research questions are, the easier it'll be to design the pilot to answer those questions. So for example, suppose a utility is thinking about implementing a default TOU rate for its residential customers in order to have it contribute to resource adequacy. Accordingly, it'll be important to have estimates of the peak demand reduction from customers facing the rate. So your first cut at a viable research question might read a little like this. Do my customers reduce peak demand on a TOU rate? However, is that really specific enough for future decision making? You see, if you're interested in resource adequacy, then are you trying to measure any form of peak demand, or maybe you need to focus on specific types of peak demand? Likewise, will any reduction in peak demand suffice for future decision making, or is there some minimum threshold below which you would not move forward with a full-scale rollout? The research question is currently posed now seems a little bit too vague, so let's improve it. You could instead ask, do my customers reduce coincident peak demand by at least 10% on a TOU rate? So as written, this now seems like it should be sufficiently precise, right? Or can we still improve it? Well, this question looks across all customers, but are the experiences and performance of certain subsets of customers potentially a more critical driver for future decision making? In particular, concerns have often been raised in many jurisdictions about the impacts of default or even voluntary TOU pricing on our most vulnerable customers. Notably, are they able to respond to these types of rates? So you may want to refine this research question to focus on, say, low to moderate income customers, as their capabilities or lack thereof may be the deciding factor in moving ahead with default TOU. Likewise, the utility can design its TOU rate in lots of different ways. The literature is pretty clear that the higher the price ratio, the more a customer will reduce peak period consumption. So clearly the pilot will test one or maybe one or more specific TOU rate designs, so why not reflect that in the research question as well? So with all that in mind, you can further improve and refine your research question as follows. Do my low to moderate income customers reduce coincident peak demand by at least 10% on a TOU rate with a 4-to-1 price ratio? Now, you should be better able to focus your design efforts on the objectives that the pilot is intended to achieve in order to inform future decision making. The more you can develop sufficiently specific research questions and link them to what's critical for making determinations about how to proceed, the more effective and successful your pilot will be. So the next step will be to prioritize all of the highly specified research questions that came out of your brainstorming session. My guess is you'll have generated tens, if not hundreds of research questions. Now, in my experience, that brainstorming effort is really successful at getting everyone to, put down their pet questions or their secret burning desires for the pilot, but clearly not all of them can be pursued. In fact, you probably won't be able to address a lot of them. And if you tried to, you probably would end up not answering any of them all that well. So it'd be wise to prioritize them in order to narrow the list down substantially to only those that you really want and need the pilot to focus on and be designed around. To that end, you might want to assess the level of importance and urgency associated with answering each research question you came up with. So if the research question is both important and urgent to answer, well, then it should obviously be kept as part of the pilot. Alternatively, if it's both unimportant and not that urgent to be addressed, it can clearly be dropped. There will be those research questions that are important for you to answer, but may not be critically urgent to do so. Answers can really come down the line, so you could put a pin in these and come back to them. These ones do not need to be part of the pilot at this time. Lastly are those research questions that if you're going to answer, must really be done so in the near term, but whose answers generally are pretty unimportant. Thus, you would drop these as they really don't matter in the grand scheme of your decision-making effort that the pilot will help inform. Again, it's important to reiterate that the objective of the pilot is to inform future decision-making. If something doesn't meaningfully and substantively contribute to that, then it should really be dropped from being a focus of the pilot. With the subset of critically important and urgent research questions in hand, they should next be translated into testable hypotheses. Ideally, a statement should be worded in such a way that it can only have one of two outcomes. Either it's rejected because the results suggest or affirm that the statement is false, or it's not rejected because the results cannot demonstrate to a sufficient degree of confidence that the statement is in fact false. Now, such a statement is called a null hypothesis. Statistically speaking, null hypotheses cannot be deemed to be true. So wording them in a way that more readily allows them to be rejected is advantageous from a pilot design standpoint. As with the previous step, this may also result in an expansion of the number of possible null hypotheses that the pilot seeks to test. A single research question could spawn multiple null hypotheses. And you see this to be the case in the example shown, which was taken directly from the Sacramento Municipal Utility District's Smart Pricing Options pilot. At this point, we want to digress for a moment from the content included in the report. Now, as an added bonus for those of you attending today's webinar, we're going to share with you some anecdotes from our own experiences with pilots that are not contained in the lab report. Now, the intent of these anecdotes is certainly not to denigrate or embarrass any utility, so all of these little vignettes are going to be anonymized. Rather, what we hope to accomplish with these is that they serve as cautionary tales, illustrating the challenges that can and certainly have occurred if a step in this process is not pursued. From our standpoint, it's best to learn from history instead of being doomed to repeat it. So, in this first case, a utility who wanted to pursue a pilot developed the following hypothesis. A well-designed education and outreach program based on individual and social behavioral leading practices on top of the existing inverted rate could induce customer energy efficiency and demand response behavior. Well, Based on what we just talked about, this statement does not represent a testable null hypothesis for a number of reasons. First, it uses conditional language like could instead of declaratory language like will. It's not clear what the basis of comparison will be for assessing success. Is the point to see if the education and outreach program based on leading practices results in greater energy efficiency and demand response relative to no education or outreach program? Or are we really trying to view this relative to education outreach programs that do not use leading practices? Finally, the statement attempts to test multiple concepts. Is the intent to design the pilot to assess the impact of a joint, well-designed education and outreach program, or to assess the impact on customer behavior differentially and independently for an education program relative to an outreach program? Likewise, are joint changes in energy efficiency and demand response the goal, or should they be measured separately? As you can see, this null hypothesis really leaves a lot of room for improvement and doesn't clearly help determine how the pilot should be designed. Now that you've sufficiently determined what it is you want to study, by developing this robust set of hypotheses, you can really turn to the design of the pilot that best helps test those hypotheses. Now, in order to do so, there are 4 major design decisions that should be made. The first is to determine what level of power and precision is required when testing these hypotheses. From a statistical standpoint, a pilot with a high degree of power provides greater precision in the estimation of the effect being measured than a pilot with lower power does. Statistical power affects the probability that a test correctly rejects one of your false null hypotheses. However, the general concepts of power and precision also can be applied in a non-statistical setting to help assess how robust a more qualitative pilot would need to be. Consideration when determining the right level of power and decision should include an assessment of how the results of the pilot will be used down the road. For some things, lesser power and precision are far less critical for future decision making. You may only need a general sense that what you're testing works or is viable moving forward. This might be the case when a pilot is focused on process or functional capabilities. In other instances, it may be critically to robustly understand the outcomes of a pilot in order to determine, say, cost effectiveness of what's being tested. There's also a clear trade-off between power and precision and the cost and size of the pilot. Pilots with a high degree of power, and hence precision, are highly unlikely to reject a hypothesis either quantitatively or qualitatively, when in fact it should not be rejected. And the reverse is true for a pilot with lesser power and precision. A pilot that incorrectly rejects a null hypothesis is ultimately a waste of utility and ratepayer resources, as it results in a pilot that draws erroneous conclusions. However, pilots with a high degree of power will also, all things being equal, require larger sample sizes than pilots with lower levels of power. A pilot that collects more data than necessary to answer the identified hypotheses also results in a waste of utility and ratepayer resources. So a balance must be struck when determining the appropriate level of power and precision that a pilot will be designed to have and the effects on the pilot's budget due to the resulting required sample size. Next, it's necessary to consider what constitutes an acceptable chance that confounding effects could distort the outcome of a hypothesis test. Put differently, could something other than what the pilot is trying to test be the cause for the outcome that is observed or derived? In some cases, it's critical that the pilot's design limits to the degree possible all opportunities for such confounding effects. These pilots require a high degree of internal validity. Alternatively, it may be that isolating the effect of what's being studied in the pilot is less important, and therefore it's acceptable for outside factors to affect the pilot's outcome. Aside from internal validity, the design of the pilot can also have consequences for external validity, or the degree to which one can extrapolate findings from the pilot to some group that's not included in the pilot itself. As discussed previously, the literature review obviously was intended to help inform if the results found by others could be considered applicable to your particular pilot activity. Now, in some cases, it may be very appropriate to extend the results of a pilot to those who didn't participate in it, or to circumstances that differed from those in the pilot as it was implemented. But in other instances, it may be completely inappropriate to do so. You will need to determine the degree of external validity you want with regards to your pilot. Now, based on the outcome of the 4 prior pilot design steps, a research method will be selected which will drive the final design of the pilot. Research methods determine how data will be gathered and subsequently analyzed. Now, there are 3 general classes of research methods: experimental, quasi-experimental, and non-experimental. The first of these research methods attempts to test for causal relationships between elements in the pilot, while controlling for external factors that may affect those elements. Methods that directly employ random assignment of participants to specific treatments of the pilot, as well as to a control group that is not exposed to the elements being tested, are classified as experiments. These are considered to be the gold standard for establishing causal effects, and therefore have the highest internal validity. These methods include various forms of randomized control trials or randomized encouragement design. Quasi-experimental methods, in contrast, lack direct random assignment, but nonetheless seek to assess the causal effect of pilot elements by controlling for extraneous effects, albeit in a less rigorous manner than true experiments. Quasi-experimental methods include non-equivalent group designs that rely on a matched control group, or maybe regression discontinuity designs, and that's to name sort of just a few. In some cases, the pilot cannot or will not be designed to employ random assignment, and a determination is made that it's either impossible or infeasible to rigorously control for extraneous effects. Yet there's still a strong interest in deriving quantitative results from testable hypotheses, for testable hypotheses, excuse me. Such non-experimental methods test for relationships that are correlated, but require a set of assumptions, some of which may need to be quite strong to infer causality. Because these methods do not control for all relevant external factors, the subsequent analysis of the data generated by the pilot may produce results that include confounding effects, meaning the impacts measured in the pilot may have less internal validity. Non-experimental methods include correlational designs, descriptive designs, and developmental designs. If a pilot is focused on assessing the perceptions and attitudes of participants concerning the elements under study, well, then more qualitative methods are likely to be appropriate. Interviews, focus groups, or survey instruments are all methods for collecting data in a very structured manner. Although survey methods may also be the simplest way to collect data from pilot participants to test hypotheses, they also present some of the greatest challenges when it comes to internal validity and reliability of results vis-a-vis the other research methods discussed previously. Poorly designed or administered survey methods can generate responses that unfortunately do not relate to the underlying research questions. Survey questions can be subject to misinterpretation. Responses may lack consistency from one participant to the next and may exhibit significant selection bias, limiting the ability to extrapolate results to the rest of the utility customer base. Alternatively, case studies can be employed to examine an issue and its associated contextual conditions in greater depth. Instead of relying on statistical analysis of data from the pilot sample, quantitative case study methods often rely on deductive reasoning to empirically test initial hypotheses. In contrast, more qualitative case study approaches require the evaluator to understand and interpret what's being observed in the context of the pilot's environment. Both create opportunities for detailed and comprehensive assessments of innovation, processes, and policies, but they also create ample opportunity for subjectivity to drive the assessed outcome. In turn, both approaches result in challenges for reliability of the results, as well as their internal and external validity. Excuse me. The decision about which research method to use will be predicated on the assessments described above concerning power, precision, internal and external validity. Experimental research methods generally have higher degrees of internal validity than quasi-experimental methods, which in turn have higher levels of internal validity than non-experimental methods. Although experimental and quasi-experimental designs can both be used to produce results of roughly comparable power and precision, all three can be implemented to ensure similar degrees of external validity. So, based on the objectives and ultimate design of the pilot, a formal evaluation plan can be developed. It provides documentation concerning the subsequent analysis effort that will be undertaken at one or more points after the pilot begins. However, this evaluation plan should ideally be developed concurrent with or immediately after the design of the pilot. Absence of meaningful feedback and interaction between the design and evaluation efforts risks not thoroughly and comprehensively addressing the critical issues, research questions, and hypotheses that are to be the pilot's focus. The evaluation plan establishes metrics for testing hypotheses, identifies the data required to construct those metrics, and determines the most appropriate evaluation methods and techniques to ensure this problem will not occur. This is especially important because many pilots require data be collected and possibly analysis undertaken prior to the start of the pilot. Some pilots intend to test elements that are partially or completely foreign to their participant. In order for the pilot to be successful, some degree of education may need to precede the pilot to ensure the solicitation for participation enables well-informed decision-making. Furthermore, there may be value in continuing to educate customers throughout the entirety of the pilot or its strategic points. I just lost my train of thought. Strategic points during its execution, excuse me. To that end, the pilot should have an education plan developed and implemented well before anyone is ever recruited onto it. Once the education plan is implemented, there should be opportunities to assess its effectiveness in order to develop lessons learned for future educational activities. Excuse me. If the goal of the education plan is to help customers make more informed participation decisions, then the marketing plan is intended to drive customers towards participating in the pilot. The marketing plan should include the messages and material that will be used to communicate the opportunity presented by the pilot to potential participants. It should also include a process for effectively and efficiently onboarding customers into the pilot. The style of these promotional materials should mimic, where appropriate, the marketing materials that would be used in a broad-based rollout of the tested program to ensure external validity of the pilot. As with the education plan, it's worth evaluating the effectiveness of the marketing plan to inform future best practices. It's also worth developing an end-of-pilot campaign to support the transition of participants to whatever comes next. At this point, it's worth interjecting another cautionary tale. Now, in a relatively recent pricing pilot, a utility hired a leading marketing consultant to develop education and marketing material, as well as a process for enrolling customers. The utility went out into the field based on that material, and after 3 waves of marketing, the utility had only been able to recruit about 20% of their target pilot sample. An ex-post evaluation found 2 major problems. The marketing material to solicit enrollment did not incorporate industry best practices, gleaned from other utility market research efforts, pricing pilots, and full-scale rollouts. Even when the material engendered interest in the pilot, the online enrollment process was far lengthier than customers were willing to put up with. Many simply ran out of patience and never made it to the end. Ultimately, the utility had to make some dramatic changes for an unplanned phase 2 of the pilot, and as a result, had to delay the entire pilot by a year. All right, back to our process. In some circumstances, it may be necessary to engage certain types and groups of customers in new and different ways intended to build trust and comfort with the utility as a precursor to any offerings or actions the utility will undertake. Some pilots may also benefit from engaging key stakeholders that include manufacturers, vendors, and even contractors. Accordingly, certain types of pilots may necessitate the development of an outreach plan to improve the likelihood of success. If the education, marketing, and outreach plans are successful, then many different entities and organizations will be interested in tracking the progress of the pilot. It may be beneficial to develop a plan that lays out how and when the utility will provide updates on its progress and success. The plan might also identify the content of these communications, which may vary as the pilot advances, as well as the audience for those communications. Turning to more internal issues, pilots often require a utility to integrate a lot of different information technology systems that were previously independent of each other or now need to interact in very new and challenging ways. The more IT systems that need to be integrated, the more opportunities there are for problems and failures that may determine the success of the pilot. Or excuse me, may undermine the success of the pilot. Now, this is especially true when the IT systems involved span the utility's back office, they're out in the field, and may even be within a customer's premise. Communications networks, computational resources, firewalls, and other security protocols, as well as physical access to the various systems, create myriad challenges in the pilot's planning and execution phases. Given the critically important role that IT systems play in the overall success of many pilots, utilities should develop an IT plan that identifies all the systems and their functions that will be leveraged by the pilot and assess how those systems will work together. The plan should also identify feedback loops to ensure problems can readily be identified and ultimately solved. Utilities would also be well served developing a data management plan. Such a document identifies all the data elements that should be collected in the pilot and what they will be used for. It will determine how each data element will be collected, how it will be organized, where it will be stored, and what the data source of record is. Lastly, the plan should illustrate how those data will be accessed and who will have access to them. Excuse me. Given the opportunities for problems with IT systems, I think it's time for another cautionary tale. In this case, a pilot was designed to test utility-provided but customer-controlled programmable communicating thermostats, or PCTs, which were able to receive price signals and execute cooling strategies according to pre-programmed settings. Unfortunately, at the outset of the pilot, the utility experienced substantial challenges reliably sending prices to the PCTs that were correctly received and acted upon. In one instance, the utility actually sent the wrong prices out. Realizing their error, the utility corrected the problem by sending out a second price to the PCTs. However, the PCTs for a very large number of participants failed to acknowledge the increased price. Accordingly, the PCTs never executed the appropriate control strategy, which would have been to reduce the participants' electricity consumption. Once this problem was found, the utility had to issue bill credits totaling about $200,000, a costly mistake for what started out as someone hitting the wrong button. Now, to illustrate the importance of developing a comprehensive data management plan prior to the commencement of the pilot, we have another cautionary tale for you. A utility wanted to understand the impact of different forms of technology on customer response to different time-based rates. However, during the pilot's enrollment process, the utility didn't collect information about a customer's eligibility to receive any of the included technologies. Instead, the utility designed the pilot to allow every participant to have 2 technology assignments. If the customer was able to receive the primary technology, well, she was given the secondary technology. Unless, of course, she was incapable of receiving either of them, which they didn't really plan for. Well, unfortunately, the utility misplaced the data file that contained the original technology assignments. This, in turn, undermined the initial experimental design, necessitating a change of course regarding the subsequent load impact evaluation effort. Had the utility developed a more robust data management plan up front, it could have avoided the additional expense and challenge associated with overcoming this data problem. Now, even some of the simplest pilots touch on a number of different parts of a utility's internal organization. They might require access to staff and resources in information technology, as we already discussed, but also customer service, operations, and maybe reg affairs. However, pilots, because of their small-scale nature, may be considered lower priority for some of these staff. Because of this, it may be difficult for a pilot manager to gain access to the resources needed to plan and execute the pilot successfully, let alone solve problems in real time that can quickly create both short-term and long-term challenges for the overall success of the pilot. Although a formal plan may not always be needed, it's valuable to have some form of documentation that identifies how the pilot will have the necessary access to staff and technical resources at different points during the pilot's design. Implementation and evaluation phases. Another way to ensure that the resources are available when they're needed would be to gain the support of senior managers, if not executives, to create cross-functional teams that meet on a periodic basis. This approach not only signals to staff and other leadership the importance of these pilots, but also creates lines of communication and opportunities for a shared vision and mission for the pilot that should ultimately lead to a greater likelihood of success. These cross-functional teams can help maintain a certain level of situational awareness across the various aspects of the pilot throughout its implementation and execution. If a pilot arises in one area, if a problem arises in one area, it can quickly and efficiently it can be quickly and efficiently communicated to the rest of the team, who can then collectively identify the optimal short-term workaround, as well as long-term solution that may require assistance from staff from several different parts of the utility. So, in this next cautionary tale, a utilities pricing pilot included language requiring that the notification of an event occur at least 24 hours prior. The utility set up an internal cross-functional team of pilot managers, IT, operations, and customer service personnel, given how many different parts of the organization would need to simply dispatch a CPP event. Prior to the start of the pilot, the notification process was tested on about 100 people to ensure it worked as expected. However, when the pilot went live and the system was asked to send out notifications to thousands of participants, it got bogged down. Notifications were delayed for the majority of participants who didn't receive them until well after the agreed upon deadline. Due to the existence of this cross-functional team, the utility was able to quickly identify the problem, determine a solution, and execute it. The needed resources were available to the pilot team, thereby avoiding a substantial number of customer complaints. So, by now, it should be pretty clear the value of contingency planning. This need not require a formal document, but rather should be an integral part of each of the previously discussed plans. Problems are going to arise at various stages of any and all pilots. The issue is really how quickly and comprehensively they can be mitigated and addressed. As you've seen, in some cases, these problems can be catastrophic for the success of a pilot. Now, clearly not all contingencies will or can be identified ahead of time, but spending time up front identifying some of the more likely challenges will surely pay large dividends during the pilot. At this point, all the planning for the pilot is now complete. It's been designed, and you have a clear process in place for how it'll be implemented, as well as how it'll be evaluated. So what are you waiting for, right? Get out there, go in the field, run your pilot based on all the planning that you've undertaken. So our last cautionary tale illustrates what can happen when individuals elect on their own to deviate from the previously developed plan. The utility was on the verge of going out into the field with its pilot. At the 11th hour, the pilot's manager decided to alter the recruitment material. What became obvious several months later upon review of that material was that it seemed to now be soliciting customers to complete a survey for the utility. And as an incentive for doing so, participants could win an iPad. Most customers didn't realize that by completing the survey, they would also be enrolled in the utility's new pricing pilot. To make matters worse, there was a substantial delay between the enrollment process and the commencement of the pilot, such that when the utility finally did reach back out to those who completed the survey 6 months later, many customers said they did not remember signing up for the pilot. And as a consequence, the utility experienced a 50% attrition rate before the pilot even began. With so few customers participating in it, any evaluation effort of the pilot would likely be incapable of producing accurate and credible load impact results. Thus, the utility was forced to cancel the pilot outright and completely redesign it. Moral of the story? Stick with the plan. But if it is to be altered or deviated from, gain some consensus from others who helped develop it in the first place. So the final step in the process is to reflect on the pilot and the evaluation results to draw meaningful conclusions and determine how to proceed. Since the goal of the pilot has always been, or should have always been, to inform future decision-making, you're now at a point where that decision-making can occur. You have the results of your pilot in hand and can now determine if or how to move ahead. Consider it mission accomplished. So, we hope that you now see that effective and comprehensive planning should help improve the likelihood of success for a pilot by also increasing the transparency of the various steps in the process. For some pilots, the degree of formal documentation may be much smaller than others, given their limited budget or reduced consequences. The pilot fails to produce results which promote continuation and expansion. In other cases, each of the steps identified may warrant substantial documentation, given the importance of what may be at stake. Ultimately, it's up to regulators who may need to approve pilots and their budgets for cost recovery to determine the minimum requirements so that utilities can, they can make informed decisions that meet their statutory obligations as well as their policy objectives. The question for regulators and policymakers ultimately is the balance needed between ensuring there's sufficient oversight of the key elements outlined above to make a pilot successful, and the limitations that may place on the speed of and utility interest in innovating through the use of pilots. The greater the level of oversight, the slower the pilot is likely to proceed. Each step of the process will require some degree of utility documentation, subsequent utility review, and potentially regulatory approval. And the more regulators and policymakers can create an environment of utility ownership over the pilot's purpose and outcome, the more likely the utility is to support it and do what's necessary to ensure its success. In some cases, a utility may be highly interested and engaged in the pilot, suggesting that they have a greater sense of ownership over its outcomes. This may potentially result in less need for regulatory oversight, or at least in certain areas. In other cases, a regulator or policymaker may really push a utility in a direction it's otherwise disinterested in, uncomfortable with, or outright opposed to. With more limited sense of ownership over the pilot, a utility may require substantially more oversight on the part of the regulator. Now, regardless of the approach taken or the motivation for doing so, pilots will continue to play a critical role in allowing regulators, policymakers, and utilities to learn from their experiences in order to inform future decision-making. Hopefully, this webinar has provided sufficient detail such that these entities can now better understand the key elements that will enable more successful pilots. So, with that, let's turn to any of the questions that may have arisen during the webinar. If we're ultimately unable to get to any or all some of those questions, then we'll send out a document that answers all of them to all registered participants.
So Pete, just so I can hop in here and help facilitate that, we had one clarifying question that I attempted to answer, but I wanted to confirm with you what PCT stands for.
Right, Programmable Communicating Thermostat. So these are basically automated thermostats. Think of like a Nest thermostat, right? These are ones that oftentimes have two-way communication. They can accept things like price signals or control signals from a utility, execute a strategy in response to those that's going to change the set point. So.
And then just, it wasn't asked about, but the acronym CPP was also used. So maybe you could clarify that in case folks don't know.
Sure. CPP stands for Critical Peak Pricing. So this is a rate design where the price of electricity rises dramatically, usually by 10 maybe to 12 times what the rate usually would be, but it does so on a relatively infrequent basis and usually for a very relatively short period of time. So these are sort of declared, let's say, emergency events where the utility is looking for a customer to reduce their consumption over a 4-hour block on a really, really hot summer afternoon. And so they'll increase the price dramatically. They'll notify customers that that event is going to occur in the following day. And then those prices go into effect during that 4, 6, whatever hour period that following day.
Great. So in terms of a little bit more kind of involved questions, there was one question about the tendency to develop a pilot to kind of punt the ball, quote unquote, in order to avoid making concrete immediate decisions. And there's a question as to whether you could provide any guidance with respect to that to public policymakers or regulators that sort of are unsure about something new proposed to be tested in a pilot.
So to clarify, Anna, the question is really about the instances where utilities are sort of using a pilot as a delay tactic. Is that sort of what we're talking about?
I believe that's the context.
Okay. So I think the way to counter that is going back to this issue of what do you need for decision making? So if this is an area that, let's say, a regulator, stakeholders want to move in the direction of, and a utility says, oh, we need to pilot this, then I think the question needs to be, okay, what is it that the pilot is going to ask and answer that we don't have information on right now that would help us determine if we should move ahead with it, right? Because the pilot is really there to answer these unanswered questions. And so the way to ensure you don't just pursue a pilot to delay something is you make very clear what are those unanswered questions that this pilot is going to answer. It illustrates the need for the pilot as opposed to just moving ahead. And so if the utility can make that argument, sufficiently, or the regulator can identify, or stakeholders can identify those questions that a pilot really is going to need to answer to move ahead, then it illustrates the value of the pilot. But if it's just, oh, we need to see if we can do this, okay, well, maybe that's sort of that definition of that second type of pilot I talked about at the very, very beginning of the presentation, where this is really about making sure we're capable of implementing whatever it is we're talking about. And there, the pilot might be much shorter lived, right? It might be 6 months instead of 2 years because you're focusing on like back office systems and making sure a transition will be successful. So to me, those are ways in which you try and make sure that a pilot is not a delay tactic, but that it actually has something concrete as a purpose. And it ultimately, again, feeds into this idea of how am I going to use the results of this to answer and move forward in the future?
Okay, great. So then there's a question. Do you have an example of a good pilot targeting certain customers while still avoiding confounding factors that could hurt the results? The comment being a lack of diversity in customers can add to confounding factors affecting the data.
A good pilot that targets certain customers while still avoiding confounding factors that could hurt the results. So one way in which this can be done is you limit upfront the types of customers you might enroll. So for example, you might, for a pricing pilot, you might say, I don't want to include customers with solar PV systems or customers with battery systems, because what I'm really interested in is understanding how customers change their consumption patterns purely in response to these types of rates. So you can identify as much as possible those types of sort of confounding factors and do what you can to maybe limit the population of customers you go out to. Now, to be clear, you may not be able to do this across the board, right? Like energy efficiency programs or demand response programs may be confounding factors that would affect the level of response you measure or the level of interest in customers. And so you have to kind of take all of this into consideration when you decide which confounding factors you're willing to accept and maybe embedded in the results that you get, and which ones you really want to control for because you want to isolate whatever the effect is you're trying to measure. Is there anything you want to add to that, Anna? I know this is really much more your area of expertise as an experimental economist with a PhD in this. Other things to add?
I guess what I just say, I mean, I don't have a concrete example I could provide, but I would just say it kind of speaks back to what you covered in the presentation about the trade-off between internal and external validity. The idea of if you have a particular question about a specific target population, then yes, what you want to do is target that population, but then make sure that you are doing a sufficient design of the experiment within that population. So that would be an example of a case where a pilot is very robust for internal validity relevant to that specific population, but may not be generalizable to your whole customer base. Whereas if what your concern is that there's selection into a pilot, so therefore you want to interpret something as relevant to your whole customer base, but you're concerned your pilot won't. That's a different question, and that takes some careful thinking, because oftentimes in terms of these pilots, there is going to be some selection. So there may be some approaches that might have to be taken in terms of weighting your data or things like that. So I don't know, that's sort of more, still kind of more general, but I think that's the nature of that trade-off.
It may be a good, I generally believe, I gave an example earlier on in the presentation from Sacramento, the Sacramento Municipal Utility District's Smart Pricing Options Program. To me, it is one of the gold standards of pilots. It was designed very, very well. It was implemented very, very well. It was evaluated very, very well. And it illustrates, I think it might be a good example to illustrate for you this idea of targeting certain types of customers to avoid some of those confounding effects. And you can see the limitations they put in during the pre-recruitment process to identify the set of customers that they wanted to pursue for enrollment, and what were some of the restrictions that they put in place. It just might be helpful to kind of answer this question.
Great.
Next question, Anna?
Yes, the next question is, are there any considerations, or what kind of considerations should be made when you're thinking about simultaneous pilot projects?
Ooh, yeah, I think this is one of how do you make sure pilots don't cross-contaminate each other, right? Because a lot of utilities have several ongoing pilots sort of concurrent with each other. And this is a challenge, I will freely admit. You know, trying to segment your customers in a way, you know, that doesn't cross-contaminate can be a real challenge if you're doing multiple projects at once. And so to me, this is one of those things of planning, you know, really trying to stage these pilots. If you're thinking of them, you know, multiple ones running concurrently, this gets at sort of the internal cross-functional team idea that, like, you really need to get all of those pilot teams together to figure out how you're going to coordinate them so that they don't cross-contaminate each other, they don't, you know, adversely affect each other. And as new pilots come in, again, you need to kind of make sure that that new pilot doesn't somehow adversely affect, you know, one that's already existing and in the field. So this, to me, is really goes back to this issue of internal planning and just sort of really doing as much as possible to make sure that you're aware of how they might be cross-contaminated, and to the degree possible, instituting, you know, policies and procedures to really limit that. That's really the best, I think, suggestion I can come up with.
So the next question, I think, is probably in reference to your explanation of what a critical peak pricing program is. The question is, how are increased price spikes and price volatility just and reasonable? This may be a little outside but
this is a great esoteric question, I suppose, and I don't mean that in any disrespect. Since obviously one of the basic premises of retail rates that they're considered just and reasonable. So this is more, I think, a point you can sort of argue is, you know, what level of price volatility, what level of price variability is considered just and reasonable. I'm not here to give you an answer as to what that is. I'm simply here saying these rate designs exist. Regulators are ultimately the arbiters and deciders about what designs are just and reasonable, not me. So great question, but one for local regulators to are certainly the ones to answer that question on a jurisdictional basis.
Yes, although I would point again to the Sacramento pilot that you were talking about as being a case where a lot of work was done analyzing the kinds of impacts, and, you know, at the risk of a shameless plug, you and I do have a report out on the impacts of those kind of rates for vulnerable populations, for example. So some work has been done trying to explore this question.
Right, but I think it ultimately comes down to what your personal definition is of just and reasonable, yeah. You know, and that really is what this relates to. But yeah, you're right, Anna. You know, there has been some work done looking at those types of issues for vulnerable customers, those with medical needs, low income, as well as elderly folks. And to the degree to which, you know, that can help inform your decision as to what level of price volatility is reasonable and is considered just and reasonable. I think having that research in hand, should be very helpful in helping make those determinations.
The next question is, examples of successful and not successful low income rate pilots, or do you have any of those examples? Any topic issues to note or good resources you could suggest when designing a low income rate pilot?
Examples of successful and not successful low income pilots? Given what we just, I know there's been, so my understand, I think there's been a few recent pilots that have tried to focus on this issue much more. I believe the Maryland TOU pricing pilots, this has been a pretty big issue with them. The California statewide pricing pilots that were started a few, 3-4 years ago, this was a really big issue with them because the CPUC had committed to moving residential customers over to default time of use rate. So they really wanted to understand the implications for various types of customers. So I would say those are the two that I can think of offhand. Phase 1, I believe it's phase 1 of the statewide pricing pilots in California were more focused on these types of issues. I think there was an interim and a final evaluation report. You can find that on the CPUC's website. The Maryland TOU pilot just came out with its evaluation report, I think a week or two ago. Again, that can be found on the Commission's website under the PC44 activity.
Great. And we have one more question heading into the bottom of the hour here. Do you have any recommendations for mitigating or overseeing public engagement around projects? Customers are very interested in the progress and development of projects.
For mitigating public engagement around projects or overseeing them. So the Maryland example might be a good one. The California one is another, where stakeholders have played a very important and large role in the development of pilots. Now, I will say it can be challenging designing anything by committee. So I think where those groups can be most helpful is in that prioritization, of all the different research questions that a pilot could, trying to find the slide right here. So this is where I think up to basically the brainstorming of the types of research questions and topics, I think that's where stakeholder engagement can be incredibly valuable. The prioritization of those research questions, I think, again, that's where stakeholder engagement can be really valuable. But I think once that happens, you really need to allow, again, this is just my personal opinion, you then really need to allow, and I don't want to have this come off sounding pejorative, but you need to let the experts then design the pilot in a way to as effectively and efficiently address those prioritized set of issues. The observation I've had is when that doesn't happen, you have people's perceptions, how they think things should work, unfortunately affecting the design of things. And I think that can ultimately be detrimental to the real success of the pilot and its ability to answer the questions that are laid out. I think there's also a great opportunity for stakeholders as the pilot is progressing to get updates and ask questions about the progress of the pilot. I think that's really the two places where, public engagement can have its greatest impact and greatest effect. Again, I'm a huge believer in transparency. I think that's critical for everybody to understand what the goals, objectives, purpose, see how things are progressing, and just be honest about like this, again, as we talked about at the very beginning, and I think maybe that's the best thing to end on, this idea that a successful pilot does not necessarily produce the results everybody expected. you know. The successful pilot is one that informs what's going to happen if you do this on a grander scale. And based on that, you then can make decisions as to whether or not you want to move forward with it.
Well, those are all of our questions. Perfect timing.
All right, great. Well, for those of you who have remained a few minutes past the hour, thank you, thank you, thank you. I really appreciate your willingness to stick around those few extra minutes and for just coming today to hear this. We will be posting a recorded version of this webinar, so if any of your peers, friends, or family members want to listen to it, it'll be on our website in about a week, just in terms of us editing this down and getting it posted. We will be sure to send out a link to that recording to all of you folks that have registered. So with that, thank you very much for your time. Have a wonderful Friday.